Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Daniel Wilhelm. I'm the president of the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation in New York. And it's my pleasure to be here today, both as a supporter of the Paris Peace Forum's 8th edition and as the moderator of this important panel. The foundation has been around since 1929, and in that time has focused exclusively on trying to understand issues of violence around the world through research, scholarship, and through the dissemination of knowledge. One of the topics that we've been focusing much attention on recently has been the growing proliferation of political violence, both in the United States and in other democratic systems, and how the phenomenon of polarization affects violence. Most times when polarization is discussed, it's usually seen exclusively in terms of its domestic effects. But there's another aspect to polarization, and that is how it affects the conduct of states. And that notion, from the local to the global, how polarization challenges the international order, is the reason we're gathered here today. And to help us make sense of this, we have an all-star panel of distinguished experts, and we'll hear from each of them. And then at the end of our conversation, there'll be a chance for some questions. So on the far left, we have Shamil Idriss, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Search for Common Ground. Next to him is Comfort Iro, who's the President and Chief Executive Officer of the International Crisis Group. Next is Niels Gilman, who is the Vice President for Programs at the Precursor Institute. And then finally, to my right is Arantxa González-Laya, who is the Dean of the Paris School of International Affairs at Sciences Po and the former Spanish Foreign Minister. So welcome to you all. Thank you for your participation. So Shamil, let's start with you. Before we dive into the international dimension of polarization, let's understand the phenomenon. Your organization is working in some 24 countries around the world, trying to help reverse polarization. Talk to us a little bit about the phenomenon of polarization. What do you see in your work? What creates it and what drives it?
Sure. Thank you for having me. So polarization is one of those very ambiguous terms right now, which is why you so often see it accompanied with a qualifier. Toxic polarization, pernicious polarization, effective polarization, all of these things, because the term itself is really quite fuzzy in people's minds. And in trying to address this issue, I think one of the better things that I've seen come out recently is from the Institute for Integrated Transitions as part of the Ford Foundation's a global polarization initiative that really interrogated the term and tried to define it. Without going into all the details, one of the helpful things in the definition to me is clarifying that polarization is when you have major groups who see one another as an existential threat. When you think of it in those terms, there's really no positive element of polarization because seeing another group as an existential threat is the precursor to violence. That's when violence becomes not only an option, but perhaps desirable or necessary. That's the first thing. I think the second thing is that polarization, or more specifically efforts to counter polarization, I think are oftentimes placed in this binary that is actually quite unhelpful and inaccurate, where one thinks, okay, you either need to address polarization, which are the divides in society, or address the root causes of those divides. It's the peace versus justice dichotomy always, that if you're trying to reduce polarization, are you really just sacrificing justice on the altar of civility? That's not really a helpful framing. So the way that we understand polarization, I'll share just 3 perspectives that inform then how one engages, or how at least we engage with it. The first thing is that we are in a very exciting moment, we feel, when, similar to when the medical field years ago shifted from just treating disease to preventing disease, and enabling healthier lifestyles, right? So not just treating people who come stumbling into the emergency room, but helping people stay out of the emergency room by understanding what is a healthy lifestyle and how do you stay. We're at a similar moment, we feel like, in terms of understanding what are the hallmarks of a healthy society. Not healthy in all things, but specifically as it relates to conflict. When there's an earthquake, when there's a crisis, when there's a pandemic, if there's a political assassination, what are the things we look at? What are the vital signs of a healthy society, similar to the 5 vital signs of a healthy human being that you can track? And on those vital signs, this framework now is utilized by the UN Peacebuilding Support Office, multiple governments around the world, dozens of peacebuilding organizations. But it really looks at 5 things. And polarization is only one of them, right? So it looks at intercommunal trust, or the opposite, polarization. It looks at institutional legitimacy. Do people trust the institutions that govern and serve them? It looks at levels of violence, because violence begets more violence. It looks at something very subjective, people's sense of agency. Can they do anything to improve their future or their children's future or their community's well-being? And resourcing. Where are society's resources? Where's the budget going to? Is it going to more prisons, more guns, more investments that reflect that conflict has already gotten out of control? Or is it going to more community problem-solving, nonviolent conflict resolution? The reason I go into that is because, to maintain that analogy to the vital signs of a healthy human being, polarization is a really unique and special one. It's only one of the 5 things that we track. But it's a unique one, very similar to a fever. If you go to a doctor and you have a very high fever, the first thing they're going to do is try to bring your fever down, because they understand that the fever itself can kill you. And even if it's not going to kill you, it complicates every other intervention. But if the only thing they do is bring your fever down, you're probably going to get very sick anyway or die, because the fever is never the primary cause of what's going on. And polarization is very similar. It has to be addressed, especially when it gets to the point of blocking all other interventions, but it cannot be addressed to the exclusion that we just need to build bridges across these divides and everything will get better. We had received some funding to support the COVID response in 11 conflict-affected countries, and one of the things that we saw was, when we looked into why people were spreading misinformation about the pandemic, what we found is that oftentimes people didn't even believe what they were sharing. But they so hated this government that was saying this that they were going to spread that. It was very tribal. And so when polarization gets to the level, or distrust gets to the level, where tribal behaviors are motivating more than what people actually believe or not, that's where you really have to address it. One other thing that I would share on this, I don't want to go over my time, is that polarization and autocracy, these are not, we don't have to choose between addressing one or the other. In many ways, what we see going on globally is 2 oftentimes assumed to be opposite trends, but actually 2 trends that feed one another: anarchy and authoritarianism. And they both come out of the same seedbed, which is collapsing trust. People losing trust in institutions and in one another, and either going to elect a strong man or burn it all down. And to address this kind of dynamic, one can focus on addressing authoritarianism or focus on addressing anarchy, but the real issue is to address the collapsing trust that is feeding both of them. And we have some thoughts on how one does that. And I'll just end with this last point. When we were developing that impact framework with those 5 vital signs that we identified, I came across an article in the ancient British medical journal, the Lancet. It was, I think still to this day, the largest ever study of effective COVID response. It was a 177 country study. You can look it up. I don't read the Lancet, but the findings so shocked the researchers that it made mainstream news, and I think I read about it in the Washington Post. What they found is that none of the things that they thought would correlate to an effective response did. And by effective response, they were looking at infection rate and death rate. Level of education did not. Strength of health infrastructure did not. Whether it was a democratic or autocratic society did not. Wealth of the country did not. The things that correlated to the best response to COVID was trust, both intercommunal trust and trust for institutions. And one of the real challenges to a lot of us today is, over the last 10 years, democratic systems have not been outperforming autocratic systems in terms of generating and maintaining that trust.
Thanks, Shamil. Comfort, one of the things Shamil mentioned was violence. Obviously, the International Crisis Group's business is to stand ready to identify and to prevent violence. How are you seeing this relationship between polarization and populism, which Shamil also mentioned, and violence in terms of the places around the globe where you're working?
No, thank you. It's a good question. And I mean, I'd be careful to make a huge leap between populism, polarization, and therefore violence. And the reason why I say that is that when I stand back and I look at sort of the history of violence, let's start in the lifetime of Crisis Group. We were founded in 95. I don't know whether I would have called it polarization or populism, But the worst form of violence that was driven by hate speech and hate crime was in Rwanda. And then you see apartheid, South Africa as well. I don't know that I would label it polarization or populism as well, but it was also about the breakdown of society. It was also about colonization. It was also about exclusion of one group over another group as well. Fast forward, when you look at what happened in Sudan, you look at what's happening in the DRC, you look at what happened in Kenya at the end of its 2008 elections. This was driven, again, by hate speech, by the fact that one side lost out in the election, and there were no mechanisms in which to pull back the violence. As we talk now, we're seeing a spiraling effect in Cameroon as well. So I don't know what labels you would attach to these, but certainly if I was looking at sort of various indicators, as you spoke about, that leads to violence, it is that sense of winner takes all, of being excluded, of not being able to have a piece of the pie, when the piece of the pie is cut in such a way that a bigger proportion of the pie goes to a small elite that feel that they have the right, only they have the right to be at the table to guide and navigate the future of a society. When the trust of institutions breaks down, these are the ingredients for us that inevitably lead to some kind of sectarianism, some kind of militancy, some kind of insurgency, and eventually some kind of civil war. You add that onto what other forces are doing on the outside, whether they backing one side or another, these are the sources. So over time, we adopt different languages, different narratives to describe that, oh, it's polarization, oh, it's populism, but it's also about society. And it's about the breakdown of fundamental facts in society that pit one source against another. And then you add social media, AI, whatever, and these become the mechanisms in which you can further sow seeds of disunity into society, either within that society or afar. Give you another good example, Ethiopia. We saw, by the way, outsiders, diaspora, communities, perpetuating their own version of polarizing narrative to sow seeds into already a complicated picture. You look at Myanmar, where the military junta as well captured, one of the important social media platforms and used it as a progenitor of violence. So again, I say that the worst kind of violence that we've seen for the last 30 years, the Arab Spring, another perfect example, I don't know that I would have called them, I don't know that I would have labeled them polarization or populism, but certainly when you feel disaffected and when you feel that there's grand theft, when you're trying to see elite capture, these are the facts that are driving societies to a tipping point. But I would say that not every society tips over. So another good example is Kenya. It gets itself to an edge. You see all the types of languages that are polarizing, but it never quite tips itself over. And the question why is because of the resilience of its institutions as well. So even where you're seeing the worst form of tug of war within a society, if it doesn't have that legitimizing forum that allows for space, then you will see a tipping into violence. But there is no necessarily a through line between popularism, polarization, and violence. I'd be careful to make that leap because of all the other factors I've just explained. Thank you.
And does the Kenyan example give you some optimism about what mature democratic systems in North America and Europe are facing now?
That's so interesting. When let me give you an example. When the 2020 elections were taking place in the US, and nobody imagined the 6th of January situation. I was surprised by our own reporting about that, but it was very amusing. But it was also clarifying to see a number of countries, some of them in Africa, some of them in Asia, saying, we will lend you our own years of experience of national observation or international observation to help the United States think through how it was going to deal with electoral disputes. So yes, Kenya, it gets itself to an edge, and there's something interesting happening right now in Kenya. There's a tussle between government and sort of a very youthful population, levels of dissatisfaction. There is violence, but it's not going to the scale that leads to complete collapse of a society. But I don't want to also mislead our audience to say that there isn't violence, because people have died in Kenya. People died as a result of the post-election, and that's why we call it post-election violence. The ICC bared down onto Kenya. We had a full international community come into Kenya, and then we had the result was a sort of a power arranging formula. But we didn't get to the worst successes that we've seen in other places as well.
Thank you. So let's, Arantxa, let's turn to you, if we may, and pull the lens out a bit, from the conversation we've been having so far about polarization and populism, or whatever you want to call it, and its discontents, and to look as those phenomena are increasingly prevalent in the United States, in places like Britain, France, Italy, elsewhere, and with authoritarian also more muscular in many of those places, as well as well-established in places like Turkey and Hungary, El Salvador, elsewhere. What can we identify, or what can we say about a common thread that unites, or that the common characteristics of these places, at the risk of overgeneralization, in terms of their approach to foreign policy? Because one of the things we want to explore in this conversation is how this phenomenon challenges the international order, which certainly seems under threat in a way that unlike any threat it's faced since the end of the Second World War. So what can you discern as a scholar and as a former foreign minister about what's happening in terms of the foreign policy of these forces propel?
Thank you very much, Daniel. And I like to think of this as maybe not using the word polarization, but rather radical disconnect. Because what we are seeing is a radical disconnect at the individual level, at the community level, and also at the state level, at the nation-state level. So at the individual level is pretty clear. We've heard this. It's very much exclusionary identities on which we are seeing this disconnect being built. At the community level, we are seeing this with social fragmentation, but we are also seeing this at the national level. And if you wish, the common elements that I see appearing is first this idea that is we and then the others. And these others are not very desirable. And these others are those that we have to keep far away. These are challenging us. These are challenging our social cohesion. They are challenging our identity. So it's we and it's the others, right? We see this very clearly in the debates about migration, in the debates about refugees, in dehumanization of the other. The second thing that we're seeing is this preference for power over law. And that's a big challenge for the international order, because it's an order, because there is some form of law that these same actors, nation states, have agreed to respect. And what we are seeing more and more is this respect for the law in the name of defending national interests. So back to power relations as opposed to rules-based relations. The third element that I see is transactionalism over systemic investments. So it's all a matter of how can I buy this problem, how can I buy this solution, how can I buy this country, what's the price? And there is always a price. Over investing in systems, which is what have allowed us to deal with, for example, global public goods, where it's systemic action that would get us to solutions. And the fourth element that I see in thus foreign policy is this idea that there is a contradiction between sovereignty and solidarity. and this constant reinforcement about sovereignty. And to me now, sitting in academia is a very interesting conversation, because the international system, the international order, was always an order built by sovereigns. It's not that the actors were others than sovereigns, right? But it's almost like renouncing to what the sovereigns agreed to do, which is build a form of management for their interdependence that we now see challenged with this notion that solidarity is antagonistic with sovereignty. And these are big, big challenges to having some form of order. In reality, it's very difficult to have a form of order, which is why we are seeing this order now failing in many areas, or weakening in some areas. And then what we are seeing emerging is more coalitions of countries, coalitions of actors. This Paris Peace Forum is an interesting one, which gathers actors other than sovereigns. It gathers private sector, civil society, academia, to try and find solutions. But the challenge that we're facing is not a small challenge, it's a structural challenge. And part of it, a big part of this, is driven by this idea of radical disconnect that we're seeing.
And is it an overstatement to say that the notion of an international order is antithetical to the populist movement?
Well, they want their order.
And so what does that look like?
That order is transaction. That order is based on my national interest. That order is about protecting my people, my societies, and that's a very precarious order, because a lot of the challenges we have to face are transboundary in nature. They are systemic in nature, and they can only be tackled through this lens of we are doing better if we do this with this idea of common responsibility, right?
Might the interests be more personal on occasion?
Well, I leave this to you, Daniel, but it's a lot about personal interests. And by the way, it's very interesting to see that a lot of these personal interests are masculine personal interests. Sorry for saying this.
Thank you. Nils, we've started to touch on a number of these global challenges: climate instability, mass migration, resource scarcity, wealth inequality, the advent of new fundamentally disruptive technologies, the widespread loss of trust in democratic and multilateral institutions. I could go on. But all of a response to all of those things seems to require collective action. And as we've been hearing right now, collective action seems to be at a premium. Can you, you're a historian, you're also someone who's been deeply involved in technology. Help us understand what this moment means for collective action, and how history and those who look to the future might guide us.
Thank you. I want to actually, before I answer the question directly, track back to a couple of things that were said earlier in the conversation. 10 years ago, 15 years ago maybe now, I did some consulting work with an organization called the Political Instability Task Force, which was actually set up by the Clinton administration in the aftermath of the Rwandan genocide. And it was tellingly called initially the Failed State Task Force. And what it was charged with doing was trying to anticipate, predict where the next genocides or politicides or coups were likely to happen. And this was a huge quantitative research project where they did sort of bottoms-up analysis with every kind of variable you can imagine. And it turns out that what's the number one variable that predicts whether there's going to be a coup or a genocide in a country? It turns out it's infant mortality rate. And that's not because dead babies cause coups or genocides. It's because countries that have incredibly poor performance are vulnerable to those kinds of things. So I first became alarmed about the situation in the United States, specifically coming out of that work 10 years ago, because beyond this one variable, they came up with a number of other variables that tend to be predictive of whether there's going to be political violence, whether it's the form of a coup or a politicide or a genocide. Polarization was one of them, and specifically when you have polarization that leads to existential threat narratives that are diametrically opposed, where one group, one out-group, sees another outgroup as an existential threat to themselves. I mean, Rwanda is the classic case of this, but you see that increasingly in a lot of other societies where people see it's zero-sum and it's existential. Being armed to the teeth, a highly fragmented media environment, the introduction of new media services often. We know about Radio Rwanda, for example, and its role in the genocide there. So you look at all those variables, and I was looking at that in the summer of 2015, and there's also a gendered aspect to this with Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, and I was pretty alarmed. I thought that, when Hillary won, which I thought she was going to, and I guess everybody else did too, that there was going to be an outburst of political violence. In the end, Trump won, so there wasn't. But I, for one, was not at all surprised when January 6th happened. I mean, I was surprised about the particular way it happened, but I wasn't surprised that there was violence in the aftermath of that election because there is an existential threat narrative that goes into that. But to answer your question directly about where things are going and where we might have some hope for this, I think a big part of the driver of the current crisis we have is an incredibly fragmented and uncontrolled media environment where the people who own the media platforms in the West have an incentive to encourage people to get agitated in one way or another. Now, maybe a lot of people just don't get agitated about politics, but for the people who do get agitated about politics, these platforms are incredibly inflammatory. And people who come to a thing like Paris Peace Forum probably all know what I'm talking about. But I also think technology has got to be part of the solution in the long run for bringing people together in new ways. And it's actually interesting to think about Facebook in particular. I remember a speech I saw Mark Zuckerberg give right around the time of 2008 when Obama famously used Facebook to mobilize people to the polls. And people at that time said, social media is going to be great. It's going to get lots of people together. And Mark Zuckerberg gave this speech where he said, why is Facebook so great? It's going to allow every isolated gay kid in every town to find the next isolated kid in the next town, and they're going to be able to form communities together, which I think is something that happened. What he forgot to add is that it's also going to help every previously isolated Nazi and fascist in one particular town to find the previously isolated Nazi and fascist in the next town over. And they too would be able to form communities of togetherness. And I think that that's part of what we've seen is new modes of social organization, political organization that are enabled by technology. However, I'm personally not of the view that the current crisis is one that we're going to be living with forever. New media affordances often lead to destabilizations when they first arrive. And I actually think there's a lot of opportunity for connection in positive ways using distributed systems. But I think we need to make commitments as a society to invest in those things. And governments can help here by allowing people to communicate in new sorts of ways, by enabling new forums, by enabling new kinds of connections, not just nationally. This is one way one can push back against the nationalist threat, is to talk about international connections. I think things like the Paris Peace Forum are an instance of that. They need to be less elite. They need to be less exclusive. But I do think that there's all sorts of opportunities, particularly now with AI, which can facilitate integration of conversations across a multilingual community like the European Union. There's lots of opportunity, I think, that's going to emerge over time.
Comfort, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm going to be the Debbie Downer in the room. It's now that this is becoming, because it's now affecting a number of democratic societies, this is now becoming a problem. I go back to what I said before. It was the old-fashioned radio that was a source of the worst kind of crimes that we've seen in the last 30 years. We should remember that as well. There is a crisis in democracy that is now a wake-up call for Western societies to now talk about polarization, to talk about institutions that are no longer seen as the center of trust and the guardian of society in the way that we know it as well. But when you look at what's happening, for example, today in Cameroon, or if you look at what's happening in Nigeria today, or if you look at what's happening in Myanmar today, if you look at, I mean, these have always been there. So the question that I'm asking is that, is the process that you're trying to define and articulate, is it actually going to deal with preventing the types of Rwandas that we're going to see, or is this really also just speaking to the crisis that we're seeing in a number of Western societies? Because these are not new facts for a number of the societies that are really going through the worst kind of violence that we're seeing, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I certainly don't want to suggest that technology is a panacea to any of these things. And as we've seen, it can be a polarizing and it can be actually exacerbating in some cases. I do think that, there's been a narrative in the West for a long time, that the West represents the future of the South or whatever. I actually think it's the other way around to a large extent now, that the kinds of crises we're seeing in the South, obviously everyone is particular. I mean, the situation is different in Myanmar, is different in Kenya, is different in Rwanda, is different in the United States. But the kinds of polarizations and the kinds of ways in which technologies have been disruptive of solidarities in post-colonial societies, I think that chicken is coming home to roost in a large part of the West now. So I basically agree with you, unfortunately.
I want to give one example from the context you referenced earlier, Kenya, and then another one from my own country, the United States, and just to reflect a little bit both global South and global North and pull out of them some common elements. Less than a year ago, I was in coastal Kenya, just outside of Mombasa. I met a Pentecostal minister who'd been, for a couple of decades, a really key participant in a multi-faith coalition that has become one of the more powerful interfaith coalitions along the Swahili coast. And I asked him how he got involved in it, and he said, well, let me tell you a story. He said, you know, it was 1999. It was one of the periods of the worst intercommunal violence, and I was invited to a meeting with Muslim leaders, and I was so furious, I almost didn't go. But I decided to go. And he said, I opened the meeting by saying to them, if one more church is burned down, I'm going to have 5 mosques burned down. And as he was retelling this story to me, he leaned in and he said, and let me tell you something, I could have done it. There are a lot of people here who listen to me. And then he said he had to sit there and listen to the Muslim leaders across the table talk about the discrimination and the injustice they were facing. They couldn't agree on anything that day in 1999, except one agreement they came to, which was that they were going to do everything they could to prevent members of their own communities from committing atrocities against the other side. A couple months later, he said he was alerted by one of those Muslim leaders to a death threat against him by a member of their community and protected. And that really deepened his trust. And that was the beginning, the genesis of what is now a multi-decade existing multi-faith coalition that cuts across many faith traditions, that has been very effective, not only in preventing violence, and I think comfort to your point, you know, bringing Kenya back from the brink, but also prevented politicians from exploiting the divisions of those communities in order to gain votes. It's been that kind of coalition. And the important thing about that coalition to me is that participant, that bishop, as in that minister, as an example, was not, the key thing with him, there were 2 key things about him. He had a real constituency. There were people who knew he had their backs, who he would stand up for. And I think about constituency as, you know, when something happens, there's a large group of people who want to hear what you have to say about it. Or when you say we should do something, people do it. So he had that. But the second piece that was critical about him is that he was willing to form a coalition with members of a completely different constituency with whom he'll probably never have the credibility. And together they could do something that they could never do separately. Fast forward to last year before the very contentious US presidential elections, and our team in Pennsylvania and Texas was working to prevent violence around the upcoming elections. After the first assassination attempt against then candidate and now President Trump that happened in Western Pennsylvania, the coalition that had formed there, business leaders, veterans, military veterans, religious leaders, activists, they immediately mobilized to do a few things. One, the assassination attempt happened on a Saturday. The Multi-Faith Coalition issued talking points for Christian pastors, ministers, and priests who would be seeing their congregations the very next morning and saying, here are talking points that you could use if you want to address this that might help bring your community together and prevent further polarization across political lines. Second, they went as a Multi-Faith Coalition very publicly to the fairgrounds where this assassination attempt had happened and a fireman had been killed there to reconsecrate the grounds for the purpose they were originally created, was to be a safe and fun meeting place for all members of that community. Third, they got a MAGA, Make America Great Again, endorsed local representative to go on Trump's Truth Social network and push back against the scapegoating of the Haitian community in Charleroi, Pennsylvania that was happening there. And finally, they got 2 Republican and Democratic spokespeople who have one of these annoying shows where they're attacking each other constantly. For the first time, they changed the format of their show to a dialogue on the subject of how to prevent further political violence, and then they did a state tour. The power of that coalition, all of that happened within a week of the assassination attempt. And again, like the example in Kenya, this happened because people had established relationships across constituencies. We call them multi-partial coalitions. It's too clunky a term, but they're not impartial mediators. They're not distant arbitrators. They are of the communities. They're seen as credible by the members of those communities, but they have unparalleled access, convening power, credibility, and mobilization capacity when they do it through collective action. And I think that is the kind of example. And the last thing I would say on this that's been very heartening for me as an American is seeing for the first time over these last several years, the number of Americans who are actually willing to look and learn from other societies. That work in Pennsylvania literally came directly off of the most engaging consultation that team had with anyone, which was our Sri Lanka team, who talked to them at a very practical level. What do you do heading up to contentious election? What do you do when somebody denies the results and their members rally? What do you do when somebody shows up with a gun at a polling center? What do you do when misinformation spreads the night before elections open? All of this. And they use some of those very tactics in response to that assassination attempt.
Arantxa?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to say that polarization or radical disconnect is not programmed into human nature. It's a construct. So the question here is, how do you deconstruct? Or how you prevent it from being constructed. And I see three things that we are not doing enough of, but of which we have great examples. One is people talking with people. Citizens talking to citizens without the intermediation of politicians, without the intermediation of the media, without the intermediation of social media, is going back to what we know to do, which is talk to each other. You know, I always tell my students in Sciences Po that it's easier to get to an agreement than to agree to disagree. We have forgotten how to agree to disagree, and that we have to build. The second is obviously a lot of this polarization thrive on root causes that we need to fix. Economic and social anxieties, individual anxieties, racial anxieties, religious anxieties, all of this needs to be treated. Third, leadership. And let me now mention two men, because there is also good men that have been doing this very effectively. I want to think of Nelson Mandela coming out of the horrendous individual situation he faced to be an assembler, to be one that would put people to talk to people. And I want to think of Juan Manuel Santos in Colombia, someone that did this, convinced people that it was better to accept the old terrorists back into society, because that's how you build resilient societies. So, you know, let's not take this as, you know, some form of genetically included in our DNA that we cannot get rid of. We can't get rid of it because we've constructed it.
Nils?
Let me just build on that, because I think this is a really good point. I think one of the things that we should just name is that the institutional trust decline that you were talking about has been pervasive, and it's been going on for 60 years. If you look at I know these data best for the United States, but I've seen similar data for Europe and other parts of the world. Almost in most of the developed world, the old industrial core, every single institution in society has been in decline in terms of how it polls, in terms of how much people trust them. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that there's a performance problem. I mean, this is why people just feel like their institutions are not working for them anymore for the kinds of promises that they were given, you know, as children, by their schools, by their parents, by their political leaders. We need to improve performance. And I think part of what's going on right now in terms of the crisis of liberalism is liberalism has gotten too caught up in a purely proceduralist approach to things. It's like, we got to have people just, you know, we have to have every process be included. One of the things that the far right everywhere has a huge advantage of is they say, look, things are broken. Everybody knows things are broken, and these guys just want to have more meetings. We're going to do stuff. We're going to do stuff, do stuff, do stuff, do stuff. And a lot of times the things they want to do won't solve the problem, or maybe even will make the problem worse, but at least they seem like men of action, and they're almost all men. They seem like men of action, and that's extremely appealing to people. Is they feel like, you know, instead of having another, you know, confab where we have people talk to each other and we make decisions, and, you know, we're going to have a long multilateral process for dealing with climate change. Somebody just wants to do solar radiation management, and they're just going to do it. Now, I don't approve of that. Let me be clear, that particular example. But if we really believe, as somebody said at a meeting I went to earlier this week at Sciences Po, that climate change is an existential crisis, then they can't turn around, as they did the next, 5 minutes later and say, we need to have a multilateral inclusive process that makes sure that every country from the Maldives to China gets an equal voice in the process. No, if it's an existential crisis, you have to have action. And I think that liberals have ceded the ground of action to the populist movements, particularly of the far right, and that really needs to change.
Humphrey, did you want to respond to that with microphone?
We may take the conversation elsewhere. The only thing I will say is that the people who think they are left behind now, under the fire, will still be left far behind. So we've got to be careful that the protectionism, the nationalism, that America firsters, the isolationists, it's true that liberalism has gotten a lot wrong, but deregulation will not fix the problem. This notion that the norms are so bad that they don't change your daily life, we shouldn't allow that narrative to sort of beat down all that we think is wrong. I mean, I agree with you, but I think we should just be careful in how we position it.
Let me just say one thing about that, because I agree with you that there's a narrative.
Right.
And there's certainly a narrative that motivated actors have put forward about the poverty and the ineffectiveness of the institutions. And they use that as an excuse to tear down the institutions rather than improve the institutions. It's like using a guillotine to deal with a migraine. And that's not a good solution. So I'm not trying to endorse that at all. But I do think that, we see too many societies where, and by the way, when you're in power, it's very difficult because even the people in political power only control a small percentage of the total causality of the systems that they're operating in, right? No matter how powerful they are. The Biden and Harris campaigns last year in the United States just tried to tell people, oh, the economy is not that bad. Look, it's growing. And everybody looks at their daily experience, their individual experience, and it just doesn't correspond. By the way, the Trump people are trying to do the same now. They say, oh, the economy is going great. And everybody who's been, I don't know how many of you have been to the United States recently, but if you go there, there's a lot of inflation, and there's, young people can't get jobs in ways that would be very familiar in Europe. There is a crisis. And just trying to tell people that things are not okay, at some point you can't dominate those narratives. You actually have to solve the problems. And we need action around that. And I think that if the people who are pro-democracy and pro-rules-based orders want to win, they need to just get their throughput legitimacy to work much more effectively.
So I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative here, and I think we're going to hold off on questions because this conversation has been so rich, and I want to ask everybody to address one final point, but I would encourage you to ambush everybody here in the hallways outside and ask them questions directly, because I know they'll be more than happy to speak. One of the themes that's come up repeatedly has been the idea of addressing underlying issues which are propelling populism and polarization. But obviously we don't live in a world where we have the luxury of getting our internal houses in order while we continue to operate on the global stage. So how do you balance those priorities? And keeping in mind, we're almost out of time, so go down the row, start with Arantxa, but if you can just give a quick response to how do we do two things at once while recognizing the importance of addressing these underlying issues that are very real, that speak to that disconnect you were mentioning earlier, while also trying to improve or reimagine these international systems that seem to be failing people now?
Yeah, it's not like these are two different worlds. It's not that the national is separated from the international. You can do a lot of good stuff at the national level that is going to help build more cooperative solutions at the international level. If you decide to decarbonate your economy at the national level, it's going to contribute to decarbonating the economy at the global level, right? If you protect human rights, workers' rights, women's rights at home, you will have a lot of credibility to talk about this and promote this internationally. You see, I see this in terms of coherence. And you can very well synergize. The fact that you invest internationally does not mean that you have to disregard your national obligations. And the fact that you build at the national level does not mean that you can forget about the international level. Make the two coherent. That's how I would put it.
Okay, Nils, quickly.
I'll be very brief. I think that we need to think about this moment as an opportunity not just to try to fix old things, but to build new things. And specifically, we need a new set of post-international institutions that are capable of dealing with challenges which are not just about the national interest, but are about the planetary interests. And particularly, I'm thinking of things like climate change, space junk, oceanic plastics, the nitrogen cycle. None of these things exist in a purely national context, and the current international forums we have are all about allowing competing national interests to hash it out, and they're incapable of dealing with this. So we need a new post-international set of institutions to deal with these planetary challenges.
Two things for me. I think one of the big lessons is that in the effort of including other people, don't exclude the other. To your first point, Aranch, I think that is the lesson, whichever conflict or societal tensions that you're looking at as well. And also to speak to your point, there are so many institutions out there that are crumbling on the wayside as well. And when you got that dialogue between between two communities that are fraying, I think we've got to start thinking about how we use various community leaders, not necessarily state leaders. There are other actors who are capable of helping to think through how you do compromise and how you do a more pragmatic approach to bringing societies together. You can't deal with that at the domestic level. There's no chance that you can help fix whatever is wrong with the international rules-based order today.
Thank you. Shamil, last quick word.
Double down. You can't reform a global governance system when every level of governance under that is collapsing. We get the faults at the global level that are exacerbated at the local. So there's no contradiction between moving at these levels, but we cannot faster. We have to accelerate the emergence of a different kind of leadership, the kind of leadership that believes entirely in coalition building, that understands how to turn conflict into cooperation, that understands how to navigate through polarization. And I'll just say one thing on this leadership thing, that it's always going to be easier to mobilize people around fear and hatred than around hope and opportunity. Ask any fundraiser, ask any politician. It's just easier. And the social media platforms feed that because they're making money off of engagement. So the challenge is really substantial, but we know that that kind of coalition leadership works, and we have to be investing in that at every level.
Great. Well, thank you all for sharing your thoughts and your experience, and thank you all for coming.